Rod Serling was a prolific writer who created one of the greatest fantasy TV shows of all time.
Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
It should come as no surprise that Serling wanted to bring the Twilight Zone to the big screen. He tried and tried, but it never happened in his lifetime. In this video, we're going to look at Rod Serling's attempts at making a Twilight Zone movie, how some of these efforts failed, while others did eventually get produced in one form or another. Join us through a labyrinth of development hell, which involves Jim Carrey, Sammy Davis Jr., John Landis, Joan Crawford, Paul Bartel, Steven Spielberg, Ronald McDonald, producer Irwin Allen, and comedian Godfrey Cambridge in whiteface.
All you cats look alike!
It's all in this edition of Anthology of Anthology TV Shows, The Other Twilight Zone Movies, Part 2. Previously, we looked at a handful of feature films that have connections to the Twilight Zone. You can watch that video here on the Atomic Abe YouTube channel. It's chock full of some fascinating stories that are linked to the original series in one way or another. But right now we're focused on the movies that Rod Serling tried to get made. According to his wife Carol, for years, Rod planned to make a theatrical Twilight Zone. He never had the time to put it all together. How could he find the time? On the original Twilight Zone, Rod Serling wrote nearly 70% of the show's 156 episodes. It's no wonder he didn't have time to write a feature film. But here are some of the concepts he was working on. One idea was a feature film based on a Jerome Bixby short story about a sinister boy with supernatural powers. Sound familiar?
It's good that you made that awful thing, Bart. It's real good.
Technically, yes, but I was referring to the episode of The Twilight Zone.
That's all the television there is.
Oh, it was wonderful, Anthony. Wasn't it, everyone?
Rod Serling had adapted It's a Good Life into a Season 3 episode of The Twilight Zone. The story takes place in a small Ohio town where the residents live in fear of a tiny dictator, a young boy who has the power to read people's thoughts. And if he doesn't like someone, he can do terrible things to them, like make them disappear, or worse. In a 1974 interview with Planet of the Apes magazine, Rod Serling said he was working on his third draft of a screenplay for It's a Good Life, the movie. The script never got made, Hollywood executives sent it to the cornfield, and Rod Serling died in 1975. A few years later, It's a Good Life did become a film, or part of a film, when Joe Dante reimagined the episode for Twilight Zone, the movie.
Oh, don't you think it's good?
Yes, this segment is a high point of the film, and I'm not just saying that to avoid being set on fire. Director Joe Dante has a deep understanding of a young boy's appetites, from video games to cartoons and junk food.
Peanut butter. It's good that way.
There's an adolescent cruelty combined with stylish animation that makes for some of the film's most memorable visuals. And even though this script didn't get made as its own film, the character of Anthony Fremont did get a bigger story. In the 2002 Twilight Zone reboot, actor Bill Mumy reprised his role of Anthony Fremont in an episode titled, It's Still a Good Life, a standout episode from this version of The Twilight Zone.
You can never roll enough perfect games.
Oh, that is so true.
The reunion brought back Cloris Leachman playing Anthony's long-suffering mother.
I curse the day I gave birth to you.
Rounding out the cast is Anthony's daughter, played by Bill Mumy's real-life daughter, Liliana.
I heard her. She was thinking mean things about me. They all are.
This makes It's a Good Life the only Twilight Zone episode to get a sequel in a story that spanned over 4 decades. Now let's get back to the movies that Serling wanted to make. According to the April 1983 issue of Twilight Zone magazine, Serling had written a few versions of an anthology film. Here's an excerpt from the pitch memo. This movie will be a trilogy, shot in black and white for a budget of under $1 million. The stories are separate and distinct, but have a background thread that moves one into the other. I would host this motion picture in much the same manner as the TV series operated. A lot of stories were considered for this format. One of the vignettes focused on an extraterrestrial coming to Earth where it is befriended by a child and hunted by adults. Years later, a similar idea would be made by another filmmaker. Technically yes, but I was referring to E.T. Hey look, it's Ronald McDonald. Twilight Zone fans will point out that the alien storyline was used in a Season 3 episode, The Gift.
You are a stranger, and in a way, I am a stranger too.
An alien comes to Earth, he makes friends with an orphan, and is ultimately killed by the grown-ups. It's unclear whether the movie script was inspired by this episode. Now let me tell you about one of the more detailed stories featured in that issue of the Twilight Zone magazine. This is the story of a woman. It begins quietly and with little sense of apprehension. With a white-collar secretary winding up a typical day, there is little to suggest that anything out of the ordinary will occur. Soon we discover the bizarre premise. The woman goes to a movie theater and sees that on the screen, they are playing a movie of her life. Events that happened earlier that day are being projected on the screen exactly as they happened. Fans are quick to point out similarities to The Truman Show, which is a fair comparison. But there's another, lesser-known example that comes even closer to Serling's outline. In 1966, director Paul Bartel made a short film titled The Secret Cinema, a paranoid fantasy about a secretary named Jane. Not only is her life being filmed, it's being screened at an underground movie theater.
I must be losing my mind.
Everyone is in on the conspiracy. Her boss, her boyfriend, her coworkers, even her mother.
Everyone's talking about them. I've seen several episodes.
20 years later, Paul Bartel remade the short as an episode of Steven Spielberg's Amazing Stories. The episode is basically a big-budget remake of the short, with a cast that includes Griffin Dunne, Paul Bartel himself, and Mary Warnov.
How about the turkey soup? It's delicious.
It's unclear if Bartel was aware of Serling's storyline or if Serling knew about Bartel's film. Let us know in the comments if you think it's a coincidence or if we need to contact the Writers Guild of America. Rod Serling's next attempt at a Twilight Zone movie goes on a wild ride. He wrote another anthology script made up of 3 distinct stories. And once again, the script gets rejected. So in 1967, 3 years after The Twilight Zone had been canceled, Serling adapted his unmade script as a collection of 3 novellas. This is the only time Rod Serling wrote something specifically for the printed page. Yes, there were books of Twilight Zone stories and adaptations of his dramatic scripts. There's even a comic book based on the TV show, but Season to Be Wary is actually penned by Rod Serling. The book is dedicated to Sammy Davis Jr. because it was Davis who suggested one of the stories. One morning, a white bigot wakes up to discover his skin has turned black. Serling loved this idea for a movie because he knew it could never be used on television. Unfortunately, the story, titled Color Scheme, went unproduced as a Twilight Zone movie. But a similar premise would be used for the 1970 comedy Watermelon Man. Comedian Godfrey Cambridge plays a white bigot who goes to bed after a typical day and wakes up the next morning looking very different. The film gives no credit to Rod Serling or Sammy Davis Jr. To be fair, the movie is wildly different from Serling's novella, and it's probably best that the film was made by an African-American filmmaker, Melvin Van Peebles. Curiously, a year after Watermelon Man came out, Cambridge starred in an episode of Night Gallery, directed by Steven Spielberg. You've got to wonder if he and Serling ever talked about Watermelon Man. A similar racially charged fable was introduced in the 1983 Twilight Zone movie in a segment directed by John Landis. This time, Vic Morrow plays the loudmouth white bigot who finds himself being perceived as a Jew in Nazi Germany, a villager during the Vietnam War, and a black man at a Klan rally. Landis takes full credit for the screenplay, and his dialogue even includes a reference to Animal House.
I told you guys we shouldn't have shot Lieutenant Niedermeyer.
You remember, Niedermeyer was killed in Vietnam by his own troops, making this Twilight Zone entry part of the John Landis cinematic universe. the same way Trading Places crossed over with Coming to America.
Mortimer, we're back.
The other two stories from Season to Be Wary were titled Escape Route and Eyes. These would become vital pieces of writing for the next chapter of Rod Serling's career. He adapted these stories for a 1969 TV movie titled Night Gallery. 1 year after the movie aired, it became a weekly series of the same name with a much cooler intro. Eyes was directed by a 22-year-old Steven Spielberg. This segment stars Joan Crawford as a wealthy blind woman who buys a pair of eyeballs from a living donor because he owes money to the mob.
The man needs the money desperately. He's agreed to become the donor and part with his eyes.
She then blackmails a surgeon into an experimental operation which will give her sight for just a few hours. Of course, there's a twist. She gains her sight during the Great New York Blackout.
That's not fair! It's simply not fair!
And she falls out a window to her death. It's a chilling story, a human drama that doesn't rely on any supernatural element. It would have made a great addition to a Twilight Zone feature film, but it works just as well in this TV movie. The third story from his book is titled Escape Route, about an old Nazi commander who is hiding out in South America. One day at an art museum, he discovers he can magically go inside a painting. Yes, that's right, he can enter a painting, just like Mary Poppins. You know, if Mary Poppins had been a Nazi. This skill turns out to be useful because the Nazi is identified by a concentration camp survivor.
No, Führer, you've changed very little.
Just as the authorities are closing in, he escapes into a painting, but the one he was aiming for had been moved, and he finds himself permanently trapped inside a nightmare canvas. This entry recalls one of the most dramatic scripts for The Twilight Zone, an episode titled Death's Head Revisited, about a Nazi captain paying for his crimes against humanity. The Twilight Zone always delivered some cosmic justice. The last movie we'll look at involves time travel. Rod Serling was no stranger to this gimmick. There's a lot of time travel in The Twilight Zone. Time Travelers was imagined as part of a Twilight Zone movie, but it ended up being purchased by producer Irwin Allen. Irwin Allen was a contemporary of Rod Serling who'd made some fun science fiction shows like Lost in Space, The Time Tunnel, and Land of the Giants. Irwin Allen wanted to make another time travel show, so he purchased Rod Serling's story and turned it into a pilot for a weekly series. Two men are part of a secret government project that will send them on covert missions traveling back in time.
Maybe now you'll understand why I quit the astronauts. Fell in love with history.
The 1976 TV movie didn't gain any traction. It didn't go to series. Francine York, one of the film's co-stars, offers an explanation as to why it didn't become a weekly series. Because the two leads were freaking boring. Really boring. She's not wrong.
Adam.
That sums up our list of Twilight Zone movies that Rod Serling tried to get made. And even if these films didn't get realized the way he intended, we'll always have The Twilight Zone. Thanks for watching. You can like this video, subscribe to the Atomic Abe channel, and most importantly, please hit that notification bell. It's a great way to support this channel because it helps with the algorithm. And be sure to watch our other videos about the Twilight Zone, including a time travel supercut.
What year is this? 1927.
It's 1888.